Journey into the savage heart of the 5th century, where a man born into chaos forged an empire through blood and terror. This is not the sanitized tale of a distant conqueror. This is the raw, visceral story of Attila the Hun, a warrior who made emperors tremble, who turned the Roman world to ash, and whose very name became synonymous with divine wrath. From the windswept steppes where boys learned to kill before they could walk, to the marble halls of Rome where senators whispered prayers against the Scourge of God, you'll experience the brutal reality behind history's most feared warlord. Discover the man beneath the myth, the secrets buried with his vanished tomb, and the legacy that still echoes through our darkest fears of barbarism and collapse. They called him the Scourge of God. Grass never grew where his horse had trod. When his armies appeared on the horizon, mothers smothered their children's cries and priests clutched their crosses with trembling hands. He held 2 empires hostage, extorted mountains of gold from Rome itself, and died on his wedding night in a mystery that has haunted historians for 15 centuries. But before the world knew his name, before kings paid tribute in terror, Attila was just a boy in a frozen wasteland, learning that survival meant becoming more ruthless than the wolves that howled outside his tent. This is his story, and it's far stranger and more brutal than any legend. Segment 1. Before the legend, life in the shadows. The Pannonian Plain, early 5th century. Imagine a world without borders, without cities, without mercy. The vast grasslands stretch endless under iron-gray skies, broken only by the occasional stand of twisted trees and the dark silhouettes of felt tents clustered against the wind. This is the world of the Huns, a confederation of nomadic tribes who have migrated westward from the steppes of Central Asia, pushed by droughts, wars, and the insatiable hunger for better grazing lands. Winter on the steppe is a killer. The wind cuts through layers of felt and fur like a blade, turning exposed skin black with frostbite. Children huddle together for warmth in tents that reek of smoke, fermented mare's milk, and unwashed bodies. There is no softness here, no room for weakness. Infants who cannot survive the cold are left to the elements. The tribe cannot afford to waste resources on those who will not make it. This is the crucible that shapes every Hun child from birth, adapt or die. Attila was born around 406 AD into this unforgiving world, though the exact year remains lost to history. His father, Mundzuk, was a chieftain of middling importance, brother to the joint kings Octor and Rugila who ruled the Hun Confederation. Attila was not born to immediate power. He was one of many noble-born boys expected to prove their worth through strength, cunning, and survival. From the moment a Hun boy could walk, he was placed on horseback. Before he turned 3, Attila would have been tied to a saddle, his small hands gripping the mane as older warriors rode circles around him, teaching his body the rhythm of the horse before his mind could understand language. The Huns lived on horseback. They ate, slept, negotiated, and made love in the saddle. To be separated from your horse was to be crippled, useless, as good as dead. By age 5, Attila was learning to shoot. The composite bow of the Huns was a masterpiece of engineering. Layers of wood, sinew, and horn laminated together to create a weapon that could pierce Roman armor at 100 paces. But mastering it required years of practice that left a boy's fingers bloody and his shoulders burning with exhaustion. Target practice meant shooting at rabbits while riding at full gallop, later at dogs, then at captured slaves tied to posts. Mercy was not a concept taught to Hun children. The steppe had no room for it. The food was harsh and monotonous. Mare's milk, both fresh and fermented into the mildly alcoholic kumis that adults drank throughout the day. Mutton, when animals could be spared. Marmots and ground squirrels trapped and roasted over dung fires. In desperate times, the Huns would cut their horses' veins and drink the blood mixed with milk, a practice that horrified Roman observers but kept warriors alive when nothing else would. Young Attila would have learned early that hunger was simply a fact of life, that comfort was an illusion, and that only the strong ate their fill. The nights were filled with stories. Around fires built from dried grass and animal dung, elders would tell tales of ancestors who had ridden from the distant east, of warriors who had conquered kingdoms and taken 1,000 heads, of shamans who could speak with the sky god Tungri and predict the movements of enemies. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were the education of young warriors, teaching them that their identity was built on conquest, that their destiny was to take what others possessed, that the world owed them nothing but could be made to yield everything. Combat training was brutal and began young. Boys wrestled in the mud, learning holds and throws. They fought with wooden swords until real blades were earned. Discipline was enforced through beatings that left backs scarred and bones broken. A boy who showed fear was mocked mercilessly, sometimes cast out to survive alone or die trying. Attila would have borne these trials alongside cousins and rivals, each vying to prove themselves worthy of leadership. But there was more to Hun society than simple barbarism, though Roman writers rarely acknowledged it. The Huns were skilled metal workers, creating intricate gold ornaments and deadly weapons. They were masterful horse breeders, developing breeds that combined endurance, speed, and the ability to survive on minimal fodder. They had a complex system of oaths and honor that bound warriors to chiefs and chiefs to kings. Attila was learning not just how to kill, but how to lead men who lived by codes as rigid as any Roman law. His father, Munzuk, died when Attila was still young, the circumstances lost to history, though disease and warfare were the usual suspects. This left Attila and his brother Bleda under the protection of their uncles, the joint kings. They were raised in the royal household, such as it was, a larger collection of tents, more warriors, better horses, but still subject to the same harsh conditions as the common people. The Hun nobility did not live in palaces. They earned their positions through demonstrated ability in war and leadership, and that position could be lost as quickly as it was gained. As Attila entered adolescence, he would have joined his first raids. The Huns were in constant conflict with neighboring tribes and with the Roman Empire itself. These early expeditions taught young warriors the arts of war, how to scout terrain, how to ambush supply columns, how to torture prisoners for information, how to divide plunder fairly to prevent internal conflicts. It was on these raids that Attila would have taken his first life, felt the jarring impact of sword on bone, learned to silence the voice in his head that questioned the necessity of slaughter. The Roman Empire was in decline, split between East and West, beset by internal strife and barbarian invasions. The Huns had been serving as mercenaries for Rome, playing one faction against another, growing rich on Roman gold while learning Roman military tactics. Attila was sent as a diplomatic hostage to the Roman court in Ravenna, a common practice that was meant to ensure peace, but actually served as an education for ambitious barbarian princes. In Italy, Attila witnessed a world utterly unlike the steppe. He saw marble buildings that reached toward the sky, aqueducts that carried water across valleys, amphitheaters where men fought and died for entertainment rather than survival. He observed the corruption of Roman officials, the weakness of an army increasingly dependent on barbarian federates, the vast wealth concentrated in the hands of the senatorial class, while common soldiers went unpaid. He learned Latin and studied Roman military manuals. Most importantly, he learned that the seemingly invincible empire was hollow at its core, maintained by reputation and tradition rather than strength. But he also learned to despise Roman softness. The elaborate baths, the perfumed senators, the endless debates and political intrigues. All of it seemed like a grotesque parody of strength to a young man raised to value directness, martial prowess, and the harsh honesty of steppe life. The Romans, he concluded, had forgotten how to be wolves. They had become sheep wearing wolves' clothing, and sheep could be sheared or slaughtered. When Attila returned to the Hun Confederation, he was changed. He carried with him knowledge of Roman strengths and weaknesses, an understanding of how the empire could be manipulated, and a burning ambition. He had seen what wealth and power looked like in their most concentrated form, and he wanted it. Not to become Roman, never that, but to bend Rome to his will, to make the empire pay tribute to the people it considered barbarians. But he was still young, still untested, still living in the shadow of his uncle's power. The great battles lay ahead. The legend had not yet begun. He was simply Attila, a skilled warrior among many, nursing ambitions that must have seemed impossible to those who knew him. In the cold nights on the Pannonian Plain, did he dream of the terror his name would inspire? Did he imagine that he would hold emperors hostage, that his enemies would call him the Scourge of God? Or was he simply another hungry young warrior, trying to survive in a world that devoured the weak? The ordinary world would not contain him much longer. But for now, in these years of shadows and preparation, Attila was being forged like one of the composite bows his people prized, layers of different materials bound together under tension, flexible, yet capable of delivering devastating force. The boy who had learned to ride before he could walk, who had learned to kill before he learned to read, who had survived the brutal education of the steppe and the corrupting luxury of Rome, was nearly ready. The stage was being set for a transformation that would shake the world. Segment 2. Rise of the Warrior, the Path to Glory. The year is 434 AD. King Rugila, the most powerful of the Hun rulers, dies suddenly, possibly of illness, possibly poisoned by rivals. The succession is contested, but through a combination of martial reputation, strategic alliances, and ruthless elimination of rivals, Attila and his brother Bleda emerge as joint rulers of the Hun Confederation. Attila is approximately 28 years old, already a veteran of numerous campaigns, already respected as a warrior and feared as a strategist. But joint rule with Bleda is an unstable arrangement. The sources are frustratingly vague about Bleda's personality and capabilities, but what is clear is that Attila increasingly dominates the partnership. Where Bleda may have been content with the traditional Hun strategy of raiding and extorting tribute, Attila sees a grander vision. The systematic domination of both Roman empires, the creation of a Hun empire that would rival or exceed Rome itself. The first test comes immediately. The brothers meet with Roman ambassadors at Margus, a city on the Danube frontier, to renegotiate the treaty their uncle had established. The Romans expect a traditional negotiation, conducted in a civilized manner within the city. Attila refuses to dismount from his horse, forcing the Roman ambassadors to negotiate while standing in an open field, looking up at the Hun kings on horseback. It is a brilliant psychological move, establishing dominance through symbolic action, demonstrating that Rome will conduct diplomacy on Hun terms or not at all. The demands are staggering. The annual tribute paid by the Eastern Roman Empire must be tripled, from 300 pounds of gold to 900. Roman markets along the Danube must be opened to Hun traders. Most controversially, all Hun refugees who had fled to Roman territory must be returned, including high-ranking nobles who had sought asylum after failed political intrigues. The Romans, facing threats on multiple frontiers and weakened by recent civil wars, agree to everything. This is Attila's first great victory, achieved without drawing a sword. He has forced the greatest empire in the world to acknowledge Hun power and pay for peace. But more importantly, he has learned a crucial lesson. Rome will pay almost any price to avoid war. This knowledge will shape his entire strategy going forward. The returned refugees are executed with theatrical brutality, crucified, impaled, or trampled by horses in full view of Roman observers across the Danube. The message is clear. Betrayal of the Hun nation means death, and not even Rome's protection can save you. It is a calculated atrocity designed to ensure loyalty through terror, and it works. The Hun Confederation, always prone to internal fractures, solidifies around Attila's ruthless leadership. But Attila is not content with peace, no matter how profitable. In 441 AD, he finds his pretext for war. A Hun burial ground near Margus has been violated, tombs opened, and grave goods stolen. Attila claims, probably truthfully, that the bishop of Margus himself led the grave robbery. He demands the bishop be surrendered for execution. When the Romans refuse, war begins. The Balkan campaign of 441 to 442 AD is Attila's masterpiece of military strategy. The Hun army, perhaps 60,000 strong, sweeps across the Danube. Attila has learned from Roman military texts how to conduct siege warfare, something nomadic peoples traditionally struggled with. The Huns employ battering rams, siege towers, and most devastatingly, captured Roman engineers who show them how to undermine city walls. City after city falls. Viminatium, Singidunum, Margus, where the bishop who started it all is handed over by terrified citizens and crucified before the walls. The Eastern Roman field army, the mobile force meant to counter barbarian invasions, confronts the Huns near Nisus. It is a disaster. Attila employs a feigned retreat, one of the oldest nomadic tactics. drawing the Roman heavy infantry into broken ground where Hun cavalry can encircle them. The Romans break and flee. The casualties are horrific. Contemporary sources describe bodies piled so high around Nisus that travelers years later had to find alternate routes because the roads were still blocked with bones. The psychological impact of the campaign goes beyond the military defeat. Attila makes an example of captured cities. Some are burned completely, their populations massacred or enslaved. Others are spared but forced to pay crushing ransoms. The strategy is deliberate. Some cities must be destroyed to show the cost of resistance. Others must be preserved to show that submission has benefits. It is terror applied with surgical precision. But it is during this campaign that the most significant event of Attila's rise occurs, the disappearance of his brother Bleda. The sources are remarkably vague. The Roman historian Jordanes claims Attila murdered Bleda, but provides no details. Other sources simply note that Bleda ceased to be mentioned after 445 AD, with Attila ruling alone. The truth is lost to history, but the most likely scenario is assassination during or shortly after the Balkan campaign, possibly disguised as a hunting accident or death in battle. Whether Bleda was an obstacle to Attila's ambitions or a rival whose existence threatened civil war, his removal consolidated Attila's power absolutely. From 445 AD onward, Attila is the sole ruler of the Hun Confederation, a king without rivals or equals, commanding an empire that stretched from the Rhine to the Ural Mountains, from the Baltic to the Danube. It is at this moment that Attila begins to transform from a successful barbarian king into something unprecedented. He establishes a permanent capital at a location on the Hungarian plain, though its exact site remains undiscovered. Roman ambassadors who visit describe a complex of wooden buildings, the largest palace built of smooth planks and decorated with barbarian splendor. Attila begins to hold court in a manner that mimics Roman imperial protocol while maintaining Hun simplicity. He sits on a wooden throne, eats from wooden plates, and dresses simply while his subordinate kings display captured Roman luxury. He also begins to cultivate a prophetic mystique. A shepherd reportedly discovered an ancient sword buried in the earth and brought it to Attila. The king proclaimed it the Sword of Mars, a divine gift that proved the war god himself had chosen Attila to conquer the world. Whether Attila believed this or simply recognized brilliant propaganda is unclear, but the effect was powerful. His warriors believed they fought for a man chosen by the gods, blessed with supernatural favor. The Eastern Roman Empire, bankrupted by tribute payments and the cost of rebuilding destroyed cities, negotiates a new treaty in 447 AD. The annual tribute is increased further to an almost unimaginable 2,100 pounds of gold. A demilitarized zone is established south of the Danube, Roman territory that must remain unfortified, ensuring the Huns can raid at will. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II, who had inherited one of the most powerful empires in history, is reduced to a tributary of a barbarian king. But Attila's ambitions are expanding. The Eastern Empire is cowed, its treasury drained, its armies defeated. Now he turns his attention westward, to the richer and even weaker Western Roman Empire. In 450 AD, a bizarre opportunity presents itself. Honoria, sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, sends Attila a ring and a plea for help. She has been caught in an affair with a court official and is being forced into an unwanted marriage. Whether she actually proposed marriage to Attila or simply sought his intervention is debated, but Attila seizes on the letter as justification for war. He claims Honoria as his bride and demands half the Western Empire as her dowry. The demand is absurd, transparently a pretext for invasion. But it serves Attila's purposes. In 451 AD, he assembles the largest army of his career, perhaps 500,000 warriors, including not just Huns, but subject peoples from across his empire: Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, Syrians, Herals, Thuringians, Alans. It is a vast multi-ethnic horde united by loyalty to Attila and the prospect of Roman plunder. The invasion of Gaul begins. City after city falls. Metz is sacked and burned. The Huns advance toward Orleans, intending to cross the Loire and drive into the heart of Gaul. But here, finally, they meet organized resistance. Aetius, the Western Roman generalissimo, has assembled a coalition army of Romans and barbarian federates, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, Saxons. These are the peoples who have settled within or along the borders of the Roman Empire, and they recognize that a Hun victory would mean their own subjection. The two armies meet at the Catalonian plains, near modern Troyes. The Battle of Chalons, fought in June 451 AD, is one of the most significant engagements in European history. The numbers involved are disputed. Ancient sources claim hundreds of thousands on each side. Modern historians suggest perhaps 100,000 combined. What is certain is that the battle was vast, chaotic, and extraordinarily bloody. Attila employs his traditional tactics: cavalry charges meant to break enemy formations, feigned retreats to draw enemies into ambushes. But Aetius has fought the Huns before and knows their methods. The battle rages from afternoon into night, a confused melee of cavalry charges and infantry combat across a rolling plain. The Visigothic king Theodoric is killed, his body trampled in the chaos. The casualties mount horrifically on both sides. By nightfall, the battle is essentially a draw, but strategically a defeat for Attila. He has not broken the coalition army. His forces retreat to their camp, where Attila prepares for a final stand. According to legend, he has a funeral pyre of saddles built, intending to die in flames rather than be captured if the Romans storm the camp. But Aetius does not attack. Some historians argue he feared destabilizing the balance of power if the Huns were completely destroyed. Others suggest his army was too exhausted. Regardless, Attila is allowed to withdraw from Gaul with his army intact, but his reputation of invincibility damaged. It is the first clear defeat of Attila's career, and it has profound consequences. The Scourge of God has been checked. The unstoppable conqueror has been stopped. Roman morale surges, and whispers begin among Attila's subject peoples about whether the divine favor has shifted. But Attila is not finished. In 452 AD, he invades Italy itself. The Western Empire is in chaos, its armies scattered, its treasury empty. City after city falls. Aquileia is destroyed so thoroughly that its survivors flee to nearby islands in a lagoon, founding what will eventually become Venice. Milan surrenders without resistance. Rome itself lies open, defended only by walls and prayers. And then, inexplicably, Attila withdraws. The traditional story is that Pope Leo I met Attila outside Rome, and through the force of his sanctity and eloquence convinced the Hun king to spare the city. It makes for a great story, and the church promoted it enthusiastically, but the reality was almost certainly more prosaic. Attila's army was suffering from disease, possibly dysentery or plague. The Eastern Roman Empire, recovering from its earlier tribute payments, was threatening to attack Hun territory while Attila was distracted in Italy. Most importantly, Italy had already been picked clean of portable wealth by previous barbarian invasions. There simply wasn't enough plunder to justify the risks of staying. Attila retreats north of the Alps, his Italian campaign a partial success, but falling short of the total victory he had achieved in the Balkans. He is 50 years old, ancient by the standards of the time, bearing the scars of countless battles and the stress of ruling an empire held together largely by his personal authority and reputation. He has transformed from an obscure prince of a nomadic people into the most feared man in the world. He has humiliated 2 Roman empires, extracted tribute that would have funded legions, conquered territories from the Rhine to the Volga. He has been called the Scourge of God, the terror of the world, the flagellum Dei. His name has become synonymous with barbarian fury and unstoppable conquest. Kings and emperors negotiate with him as an equal or superior. His warriors believe he is divinely favored, chosen by the gods to punish the decadence of civilization. But the legend is about to become something else, a mystery that will haunt historians for 15 centuries. Because in 453 AD, on his wedding night to a young bride named Ildiko, Attila the Hun will die suddenly and mysteriously, and with him, the empire he built will begin its rapid collapse. The warrior who survived countless battles, who had bent the greatest empire in the world to his will die in circumstances so suspicious and strange that they guarantee his story will never truly end. Segment 3. Myths, Secrets, and Unsolved Mysteries. The most enduring mystery of Attila the Hun begins on what should have been a night of celebration and ends in death and conspiracy theories that persist 1,500 years later. In 453 AD, Attila took yet another wife. He was polygamous in the Hun tradition, and this may have been his sixth or seventh marriage. The young woman's name was Ildiko, and we know almost nothing about her except that she was reportedly very beautiful and that Attila died in bed beside her on their wedding night. The official account, recorded by the Roman historian Priscus and later elaborated by Jordanes, tells us that Attila feasted heavily, drank large quantities of wine, unusual for him, as he was typically moderate, and retired to his bridal chamber. Sometime during the night, he suffered a severe nosebleed. Too drunk to wake or turn his head, he choked on his own blood and died. When his warriors finally broke down the door the next morning, alarmed that their king had not emerged, they found Attila dead in a pool of blood with his new bride sitting beside the body, weeping behind her veil. The warriors mourned in the Hun tradition, cutting their hair and slashing their faces so that, as Jordanes tells us, the greatest of all warriors should be mourned not with women's lamentations and tears, but with the blood of men. They placed Attila's body in 3 nested coffins, one of gold, one of silver, one of iron, symbolizing the plunder he had taken from 3 empires. The burial was conducted at night in an unmarked location. The slaves who dug the grave were killed immediately afterward to ensure the location remained secret. And with that, Attila vanished from history, his final resting place becoming one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. But was it really just a nosebleed? The suspicious circumstances have led to 15 centuries of speculation. Some historians believe Ildiko was an assassin, possibly sent by Roman interests who had every reason to want Attila dead. She could have stabbed him, poisoned him, or suffocated him while he slept. The official account, death by nosebleed, would have been a face-saving fiction to prevent the Hun Empire from fracturing in search of vengeance. Others suggest that Attila's older sons, who stood to inherit his power, might have arranged his death to seize control before a new wife produced potential rival heirs. The medical explanation is plausible but raises questions. Attila could have suffered from esophageal varices, swollen veins in the throat caused by liver disease, which can rupture and cause fatal internal bleeding. Heavy drinking would have exacerbated this condition. But for a man who survived countless battles, who was attended by warriors trained to respond to emergencies, to simply choke on blood without anyone hearing him or being able to help seems almost too convenient. The mystery will likely never be solved, but it remains one of history's most intriguing deaths, a world conqueror brought low not by armies, but possibly by betrayal in the marriage bed. The location of Attila's tomb has obsessed treasure hunters and archaeologists for centuries. The contemporary sources tell us the burial occurred somewhere in the Great Hungarian Plain, near rivers whose exact identification remains disputed. Legend says the Tisar River was temporarily diverted, the tomb placed in the riverbed, and then the river returned to its course to hide the location forever. Dozens of excavations have searched for the tomb, following various theories about location. Each has failed. If the tomb remains undisturbed somewhere beneath the Hungarian countryside, it would contain treasures beyond imagination, the accumulated plunder of 2 decades of conquest across half of Europe. But the mystery extends beyond Attila's death and burial. The Huns themselves remain one of history's most enigmatic peoples. Their origins are debated. They appear in the historical record in the 370s AD, erupting from the Eurasian steppe and immediately disrupting the established order. Roman writers describe them as barely human, suggesting they were uglier and more primitive than other barbarians. These descriptions are clearly prejudiced, designed to dehumanize enemies, but they also reveal Roman terror of something genuinely alien to their experience. Modern scholarship has attempted to trace Hun origins. The most popular theory connects them to the Xiongnu, a nomadic confederation that harassed the Chinese Han dynasty centuries earlier. Chinese sources describe the Xiongnu in terms remarkably similar to Roman descriptions of the Huns: excellent horsemen, composite bows, nomadic lifestyle, artificial cranial deformation practiced on infants. The timeline potentially works. The Xiongnu were defeated and dispersed by the Han around 150 AD, and the Huns appeared in Eastern Europe around 370 AD. Enough time for a migration across the steppes. But the evidence is circumstantial. No direct link has been proven. The Huns left no written records of their own. Their language is almost completely lost to history, preserved only in a handful of personal names and loan words. We don't even know for certain what they called themselves. Archaeological evidence of the Huns is frustratingly scarce. They were nomadic, leaving little in the way of permanent structures or settlements. Hun graves have been identified through characteristic burial practices and artifacts, particularly a distinctive style of cauldron used in ritual feasting, but these graves rarely contain inscriptions or other evidence that could answer the deeper questions about Hun identity and culture. The artifacts that have been found reveal a people far more sophisticated than Roman propaganda suggested. Skilled metalworkers who created intricate gold ornaments, military innovators who may have introduced the stirrup to Europe, and cultural synthesizers who absorbed and adapted technologies from the peoples they conquered. The spiritual world of the Huns remains equally mysterious. We know they practiced a form of shamanism, likely brought from the Central Asian steppes. Shamans held significant power in Hun society, conducting rituals to predict the future, ensure victory in battle, and communicate with the spirits of ancestors. The discovery of that ancient sword that Attila proclaimed the Sword of Mars fits a pattern of shamanistic belief in sacred objects that channeled divine power. But the details of Hun religious practice, what gods they worshipped beyond Tungri the sky god, what rituals they performed, what mythology explained their place in the cosmos, all of this is lost, preserved only in the most fragmentary and unreliable references in Roman sources who neither understood nor cared about barbarian beliefs. One of the most controversial theories about the Huns concerns their military tactics and their possible role in spreading technological innovations. Some historians argue that the Huns introduced the stirrup to Europe, a seemingly simple invention that revolutionized cavalry warfare by allowing riders to brace themselves for impact and fight more effectively from horseback. The evidence is hotly debated. Stirrups appear in the archaeological record around the time of the Huns, but cannot be definitively attributed to them. If they did introduce or popularize the stirrup, it would help explain their devastating effectiveness against Roman cavalry, who lacked this advantage. The composite bow used by the Huns was unquestionably superior to anything available to their enemies. Made from layers of wood, sinew, and horn bound with adhesive and wrapped in bark, these bows could shoot arrows with tremendous force at ranges exceeding 100 yards. A Roman soldier's armor, effective against swords and spears, could be pierced by Hun arrows. The construction of these bows was a closely guarded secret, requiring years of apprenticeship and access to specific materials. When a Hun warrior died, his bow was often buried or burned with him to prevent enemies from studying its construction. But perhaps the deepest mystery surrounding Attila and the Huns is why they collapsed so quickly after his death. Attila's empire fractured almost immediately. His sons divided the territory and promptly fell to fighting among themselves. Subject peoples rebelled. The Battle of Nidao in 454 AD, just 1 year after Attila's death, saw a coalition of Germanic tribes defeat the Huns decisively. Within a generation, the Huns had vanished from Europe, absorbed into other populations, or retreated back into the steppes from which they came, leaving behind only their terrifying reputation and a handful of archaeological traces. Some historians argue that the Hun Empire was never more than a personal creation of Attila, held together by his force of will and military success. Once he died, there was no institutional structure to maintain unity. Others suggest that the Huns were depleted by decades of warfare, their warrior population reduced below sustainable levels. Still others propose that climate change, the end of a warm period that had made the steppes more productive, forced the remaining Huns to migrate elsewhere in search of better grazing lands. The cultural memory of Attila split along geographic lines in the centuries after his death. In Western Europe, he became the archetypal barbarian destroyer, the enemy of civilization, a figure of terror used to frighten children and symbolize divine punishment for sin. Medieval Christians interpreted the Hun invasions as God's scourge against a decadent Roman Empire, hence Attila's title as Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. In Germanic and Scandinavian traditions, however, Attila was remembered more ambiguously. The Nibelungenlied, a medieval German epic, features Attila, called Etzel, as a generous if somewhat dangerous king. Old Norse sagas remember him as a powerful ruler who hosted great feasts and kept his word to allies. Most surprisingly, in Hungarian national tradition, Attila became a founding hero. Despite scholarly consensus that the medieval Magyars who became the Hungarians were not directly descended from the Huns, Hungarian national mythology claimed Attila as an ancestor. Medieval Hungarian kings traced their lineage back to him. The 19th century Romantic nationalism that swept Europe further enshrined Attila in Hungarian identity. He appeared on coins, in art, in literature, transformed from destroyer to builder, from scourge to founding father. This cultural appropriation of Attila tells us less about the historical Huns than about the power of myth-making and the human need to claim great figures of the past as ancestors and justification for the present. Modern archaeology continues to search for answers. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, and DNA analysis of graves attributed to the Huns may yet unlock some mysteries. There are tantalizing hints: mass graves from the period of Hun invasions, fortifications hastily erected and then abandoned, hoards of gold buried and never recovered. Each new discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, but rarely provides the definitive answers historians crave. The mystery of Attila extends even to his physical appearance. No contemporary portrait survives. Roman descriptions are contradictory and clearly influenced by propaganda. Priscus, who actually met Attila during a diplomatic mission in 449 AD, described him as short, with a broad chest, large head, small eyes, thin beard, flat nose, and swarthy complexion. But how accurate is this description? Medieval artists painted Attila as a European knight or as a demonic monster, depending on the culture doing the depicting. We will never know what he truly looked like, whether his eyes reflected the intelligence Roman ambassadors grudgingly acknowledged, or whether his appearance alone inspired the terror his name commanded. In the end, the mysteries surrounding Attila the Hun serve a purpose beyond mere historical curiosity. They remind us that history is not a complete record but a fragmentary reconstruction, full of gaps where imagination and speculation fill the void left by lost evidence. They demonstrate how a single individual can leave an indelible mark on history, while simultaneously becoming a blank canvas on which successive generations project their own fears, aspirations, and mythologies. And they preserve the terrifying power of Attila's legacy, that 1,500 years after his death, we are still trying to understand the man who made emperors tremble and who vanished into a mystery as deep and impenetrable as the unmarked grave where his bones still rest, somewhere beneath the Hungarian plain, guarding secrets that may never be revealed. Segment 4. Power, Glory, and the World They Left Behind. To understand the full impact of Attila the Hun, we must step back from the battlefield and the blood-soaked steppes and examine the world through the eyes of those who ruled from marble palaces and golden thrones. The story of Attila is not just the story of a barbarian conqueror. It is the story of how that conqueror exposed the terminal weakness of the ancient world's greatest civilization and accelerated the transformation of Europe from classical antiquity into something entirely new. In Constantinople, the eastern capital where the Roman emperor presided over a court of elaborate ceremony and ancient tradition, Attila was a nightmare that could not be defeated, only managed. The Eastern Roman Empire, still wealthy and administratively sophisticated, found itself in the humiliating position of paying tribute to a barbarian king. But this was not simple extortion. It was protection money on a massive scale, and Roman administrators rationalized it as a cost-effective alternative to war. The court debates over how to handle Attila reveal the empire's decay. The Emperor Theodosius II, more interested in theological controversies than military matters, left foreign policy to ministers and generals who pursued contradictory strategies. Some advocated appeasement and tribute, calculating that the annual payment of gold was cheaper than the cost of maintaining armies on the Danube frontier. Others pushed for military confrontation, arguing that paying barbarians only encouraged further demands. The result was policy incoherence. The empire alternately paid tribute and plotted assassination, negotiated in good faith and violated treaties, projected strength while revealing weakness. One of the most extraordinary episodes in Byzantine-Hun relations reveals the moral ambiguity at the heart of empire. In 449 AD, Emperor Theodosius and his ministers hatched a plot to assassinate Attila. They recruited a Roman ambassador named Priscus and a translator named Vigilus to carry out the plot, offering Vigilus 50 pounds of gold for success. But the Huns had their own intelligence networks. Attila discovered the plot, captured Vigilus, and sent him back to Constantinople with a message. The emperor should be ashamed of plotting murder like a common criminal. Attila, the supposed barbarian, was lecturing the Roman emperor on honorable conduct. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers, and it deepened the sense that the civilized world had become more corrupt than the barbarians it claimed to despise. The tribute payments themselves were staggering in scale. At their peak, the Eastern Roman Empire was paying over 2,000 pounds of gold annually to the Huns, equivalent to the annual budget of several provinces. This gold had to be extracted from an already overtaxed population, requiring tax increases that sparked rebellions and drove landowners to abandon their estates. The economic strain contributed to the very weakness it was meant to address. Cities depopulated as people fled to avoid tax collectors. Agricultural production declined. The military budget was slashed to pay the Huns, leaving frontiers exposed to other threats. Yet the most corrosive effect was psychological and cultural. Roman identity had been built on the myth of invincibility, of destiny, of the eternal city ruling an eternal empire. To pay tribute to barbarians struck at the heart of that identity. Roman senators who could trace their lineage back centuries found themselves negotiating with men they considered barely human. Philosophers and historians who had been raised on stories of Roman virtue and barbarian vice found themselves confronted with uncomfortable questions. If Rome must pay barbarians for peace, what claim does Rome have to civilizational superiority? If a nomad horseman can humble the successors of Augustus, what happened to Roman greatness? In the Western Roman Empire, the situation was even more desperate. The court in Ravenna, Rome itself was no longer safe enough to serve as capital, was dominated by Germanic generals leading armies composed largely of barbarian federates. Aetius, the general who finally stopped Attila at Chalons, was himself half barbarian and had spent time as a hostage among the Huns, learning their language and tactics. The supreme military commander of Rome had more in common with the enemies of Rome than with the senatorial class he theoretically served. The Western Emperor Valentinian III was a weak ruler dominated by his mother and by court factions. When Attila demanded half the empire as dowry for the emperor's sister Honoria, Valentinian could not muster an effective response beyond refusing the demand and preparing for war he knew he could not win. The Western Empire's armies were shadows of the legions that had conquered the Mediterranean world. Recruitment was nearly impossible. Roman citizens avoided military service, and even the barbarian federates were increasingly unreliable, their loyalty to tribal leaders rather than to Rome. The aristocratic class in both East and West lived in a strange twilight world. They maintained the elaborate social hierarchies, the literary culture, the philosophical debates of classical civilization, even as the infrastructure that supported it crumbled. Wealthy senators owned vast estates worked by tenant farmers who were essentially serfs. They lived in urban palaces decorated with mosaics and marble columns, hosted elaborate dinner parties where poetry was recited and philosophical questions debated. But outside their gates, cities were depopulating, aqueducts were falling into disrepair, and barbarian kingdoms were forming within what had been Roman provinces. These aristocrats had complex relationships with figures like Attila. On one hand, he represented everything they feared: the destruction of civilization, the triumph of force over culture, the end of the world they knew. On the other hand, some found in the barbarians a kind of vigor and authenticity that Rome had lost. Roman writers praised the simplicity and courage of barbarian warriors while lamenting the softness and corruption of their own society. This was not mere propaganda. It reflected a genuine cultural crisis in which the ruling class had lost faith in their own civilization. The Church, meanwhile, was becoming the true inheritor of Roman organizational genius and cultural authority. As imperial administration weakened, bishops stepped into the vacuum, organizing urban food supplies, negotiating with barbarian invaders, and providing social services the state could no longer deliver. Pope Leo the First's famous meeting with Attila outside Rome in 452 AD was significant not because Leo miraculously turned back the Huns through divine authority. The real reasons for Attila's withdrawal were military and logistical, but because it demonstrated that the Bishop of Rome commanded more real authority than the Western Emperor. The Church preserved Roman learning and administrative structures through the chaos of the 5th century. Monasteries became libraries where classical texts were copied and preserved. Bishops served as the bridge between Roman civilization and barbarian kingdoms, teaching the new rulers Latin, Roman law, and administrative techniques while converting them to Christianity. In this sense, the Church conquered the conquerors, ensuring that Roman cultural influence would survive even after the political structure collapsed. For the common people of the Roman Empire, Attila and the Huns were less a historical phenomenon than an immediate and terrifying threat. Peasants in the Balkans, already struggling under crushing taxation, faced Hun raids that destroyed villages, burned crops, and carried away populations into slavery. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals mass graves, abandoned settlements, and evidence of hasty fortifications that proved inadequate. For these people, there were no grand questions about civilization and barbarism, only survival, flight, and the desperate hope that the raids would pass them by. Yet even in this suffering, there were complex dynamics. Some Roman provincials, particularly in the Balkans, saw the Huns as potential liberators from Roman tax collectors. There are documented cases of Roman citizens fleeing to Hun territory and refusing to return, claiming they lived better and freer under Hun rule than under Roman taxation. This was both a propaganda tool for the Huns and a genuine indictment of Roman misgovernment. The empire was failing to provide the basic services, security, justice, prosperity that justified its existence and its heavy demands on its people. The Germanic peoples living on or within the Roman frontiers faced an impossible situation. They had migrated into Roman territory over centuries, sometimes invited as military colonists, sometimes forcing their way in as refugees from Hun pressure. They were caught between Roman suspicion and Hun demands. Some allied with Rome against Attila, like the Visigoths who fought at Chalons. Others joined Attila's coalition, seeing opportunities for plunder and advancement. The Battle of Chalons in 451 AD was as much a civil war among Germanic peoples as it was a clash between Rome and the Huns. After Attila's death in 453 AD, the world he had shaped continued its transformation. The Hun Empire collapsed, but the damage to Roman power was permanent. The Western Roman Empire staggered on for another 2 decades before the last emperor was deposed in 476 AD, a date that textbooks mark as the fall of Rome, but which contemporaries barely noticed, so thoroughly had effective Roman authority already disintegrated. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, survived for another millennium, but as a Greek-speaking Christian state that had less and less in common with classical Rome. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged from the ruins, the Frankish kingdom in Gaul, the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, all styled themselves as successors to Rome, adopting Roman administrative techniques, Roman law, and Christianity. But they were fundamentally different societies, mixing Germanic tribal traditions with Roman culture in ways that created something new. The Middle Ages were born from this synthesis, and Attila's invasions had been a crucial catalyst in the transformation. In the longer sweep of history, Attila the Hun becomes a symbol of the fragility of even the greatest empires and the power of determined outsiders to reshape the world. The Roman Empire had stood for centuries, seemingly eternal, its power so overwhelming that resistance seemed futile. Yet a barbarian king from the steppes, leading an army of horsemen, had brought it to its knees within 2 decades. The lesson resonated through history. No empire is so strong that it cannot fall, no civilization so advanced that it cannot be destroyed. For those who lived through these events, there was a profound sense of world-ending catastrophe. A Christian monk writing in Gaul during the Hun invasions described apocalyptic visions, believing that the end times prophesied in Scripture were at hand. A Roman senator watching from Constantinople as tribute payments impoverished the empire wrote bitterly about the triumph of barbarism over civilization. These were not merely historical events, but experiences of cosmic significance, marking the death of one world and the traumatic birth of another. Yet from a distance of 15 centuries, we can see that the fall of Rome was not simply destruction, but transformation. The classical world gave way to the medieval world, which would eventually give way to the Renaissance and the modern age. The barbarians who destroyed the Roman Empire also became its inheritors, preserving what they valued and creating new synthesis. Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God, was an agent of this transformation, not its sole cause, but a crucial accelerating factor in changes that were already underway. His legacy is written in the very geography of Europe. The migration of peoples fleeing or following the Huns reshaped the ethnic map of the continent. The collapse of central Roman authority created space for new nations to form. The experience of Hun invasions influenced medieval military tactics and fortification design for centuries. The trauma of the period became embedded in cultural memory, shaping how Europeans understood themselves, their history, and the fragility of civilization. In the end, Attila left behind no dynasty, no lasting political structure, not even a marked grave. But he left something more powerful, a legend that transcends history, a name that still evokes terror and fascination, and a demonstration that even the mightiest empires are vulnerable to determined outsiders who refuse to accept the world as it is. For rulers who sit on thrones in marble palaces, for aristocrats who believe their position ordained by heaven, for emperors who style themselves eternal, the story of Attila the Hun carries an uncomfortable message. All glory is temporary, all power is contingent, and the barbarians are always at the gates, and sometimes they find a way through.